Tonight you stand before a glass case in a quiet museum, watching a gilded child write elegant script with a mechanical hand, and you realize these were never just toys. They were whispers of a world about to be remade, though you probably won't survive long enough to see the revolution coming. The museum has emptied for the evening. The security guard's footsteps fade down the marble corridor, and you're alone with the automaton. Your breath fogs the glass slightly as you lean closer, and there it is, a small boy, no taller than your knee, dressed in silk that has faded from crimson to something closer to dried rose petals. His cheeks are porcelain, painted with a blush that somehow still looks warm after 2 centuries. His eyes, fixed on some middle distance, are blue glass with a tiny speck of white at their center to catch the light. And his hand, his tiny, perfect hand, moves across a sheet of paper, dipping a brass-tipped quill into an inkwell no bigger than your thumbnail, forming letters in French that you cannot quite read without pressing your face against the barrier that separates you from his frozen moment. You watch the mechanism through the glass of his chest, which has been left uncovered by the curators so visitors can see the secret. Brass gears turn slowly, meshing with an almost musical precision. A weighted pendulum swings back and forth, regulating the release of energy from a spring that was wound 200 years ago and has long since run down. Tonight the automaton is powered by electricity, a small motor hidden beneath the display table, but the movement remains exactly as its creator intended. The boy's elbow lifts slightly as the camshaft inside his torso rotates, its lobes pressing against levers that translate circular motion into the complex choreography of handwriting. Historians still argue whether the first person to witness such a machine felt wonder or terror, whether they saw a miracle or a threat. You feel something in between, a strange tenderness for this little mechanical creature that has outlived every human who ever loved it. The room around you holds other cabinets, other wonders. A silver swan preens beneath its glass dome, its neck articulated so finely that each feather seems to ripple. A miniature tiger, no longer than your hand, lashes its tail and bares its teeth in a silent snarl. But it's the writing boy who holds you here, who makes you forget that the museum will close soon, that the world outside still spins with all its noise and haste. Because he writes, and writing is thinking made visible, and a machine that thinks, even in this limited, mechanical way, asks questions you're not sure you want to answer. The descent who unlocked the case for you earlier told you the boy's story in rushed, practiced sentences. Built in 1774 by Pierre Jaquetros, she said, one of 3 automata he created to demonstrate his skill as a watchmaker. The others are a draftsman who draws pictures and a musician who plays a small organ. This one, the writer, can be programmed to write any text of up to 40 characters by changing the arrangement of cams on his internal cylinder. 40 characters, the length of a short sentence, a line of poetry, a child's prayer. You imagine Jaquetros in his workshop, carefully filing each cam by hand, testing the mechanism again and again until the tiny brass fingers gripped the quill just so, until the ink flowed in letters smooth enough to fool the eye. You step back from the glass and look around the gallery. The automata stand in their cases like sleeping children, waiting for someone to wind them awake. And you realize that you've stumbled into the wrong story, or rather, the right story approached from the wrong end. The writing boy is not the beginning. He is the culmination of something much older, much stranger. His gears were cut by hands trained in traditions reaching back centuries. His eyes were painted by artists who learned their craft decorating clocks for kings. His very existence depends on 1,000 smaller miracles that came before him, springs that could store energy without breaking, escapements that could release it in measured beats, cams that could translate the turning of a wheel into the curve of a letter. So tonight, you will leave this quiet museum and follow those threads backward. You'll find yourself in workshops lit by tallow candles, where clockmakers bent over their benches and dreamed of making metal breathe. You'll stand in palaces where kings gasped at mechanical wonders and philosophers argued about whether a machine could have a soul. You'll watch craftsmen file their finest gears by lamplight, knowing that they are building something the world has never seen, something that will outlast their names, their families, their entire civilization. And somewhere along the way, you might understand why this little boy, frozen in the act of writing, makes your chest ache with something you can't quite name. You leave the museum and walk backward through time, following the delicate threads that lead from that glass case into the hushed workshops where clockmakers first dared to imagine that springs and gears might do more than simply mark the hours. The streets grow darker as you go, the electric lights flickering out one by one until you're walking by torchlight down narrow medieval lanes where wooden buildings lean toward each other like old men sharing secrets. Somewhere above you, a church bell tolls the hour, and you pause to listen. Because that bell, that measured striking of metal against metal, is the grandfather of everything you've come to find. The first mechanical clocks appeared in European towers during the late 13th century, though historians still argue whether the credit belongs to an English monk named Dunstable or to an anonymous Italian craftsman working in a Milanese bell tower. What matters is the idea that falling weights, carefully regulated by a device called a verge escapement, could measure time more reliably than any human watching a candle burn or any monk chanting prayers. You climb the stairs of a fictional tower, because this is your journey now, your construction, and you find yourself in a room filled with dust and shadows and the patient breathing of great wheels turning. The clock before you has no face, no hands. It exists only to strike the hours, its hammers lifted by pins on a rotating wheel, falling against bells that send their notes across the sleeping city. And as you watch the weights descend, as you hear the mechanism exhale with each released tooth, you understand that these early clockmakers were not trying to tell time. They were trying to recreate it, to build a machine that would echo the motion of the heavens themselves. You descend from the tower and follow the sound of hammers into a workshop where a man in a leather apron bends over a bench, his face illuminated by a single candle. His name, you decide, is Jean, though he might be Pierre or Jacques or any of the 1,000 anonymous craftsmen whose names history swallowed without chewing. His filing a small brass wheel, his movements precise and economical, each stroke removing exactly as much metal as he intends. Around him, the workshop holds the chaos of creation, springs coiled like sleeping snakes, wheels stacked in wooden trays, pinions waiting to be fitted, and everywhere the fine brass dust that catches the light and makes the air seem to sparkle. Jean is building a clock for the local cathedral, but his mind wanders as he works. He's thinking about the bell-striking mechanism he saw in the tower yesterday, how the pins on the wheel lifted the hammers at exactly the right moments, creating a pattern that repeated hour after hour, day after day. And he wonders, if pins on a wheel can lift hammers to strike bells, what else might they lift? What other motions might they create? This is the moment, you realize, standing there in the candlelight. This is where automata are born, not in a flash of genius but in the slow accretion of small ideas, each one building on the last. Jean finishes his filing and reaches for a small figure he's been working on in his spare moments, a carved wooden angel that will eventually sit atop the cathedral clock, striking a tiny bell with a tiny hammer every hour. It's a simple thing, really. A lever connects the angel's arm to the clock's existing mechanism, so that every time the hour strikes, the angel strikes too. But as Jean fits the pieces together, as he watches the wooden arm rise and fall in perfect synchrony with the great bronze bells above, he smiles in a way that has nothing to do with piety and everything to do with power. He has made wood move. He has given a carved face the appearance of intention. And he knows, with the certainty of a man who has just glimpsed a new world, that this is only the beginning. You leave Jean to his work and walk on, through decades that blur like rain on a window pane. You pass workshops where clockmakers add more figures to their cathedral clocks, shepherds who nod their heads, kings who raise their scepters, angels who blow trumpets made of gilded copper. Each new figure requires new mechanisms, new arrangements of levers and cams, new ways of translating the simple rotation of a wheel into something that looks like life. And with each edition, the craftsmen learn. They learn that a cam shaped like a teardrop creates a quick lift and slow drop, perfect for a nodding head. They learn that a spring-loaded lever can store energy and release it suddenly, creating the illusion of a trumpet blast. They learn that the same principles that make a clock strike the hours can make a wooden shepherd raise his staff in blessing, over and over, for centuries. By the 15th century, the cathedrals of Europe have become theaters of the mechanical, their towers crowded with moving figures that draw crowds on feast days. You stand in the square of a German city, Strasbourg, perhaps, or Prague, and watch as the clock strikes noon. Doors open, figures emerge, a procession of apostles moves slowly across a tiny stage while crowds below gasp and point. The mechanism is hidden, of course. The figures move as if by magic, as if blessed by the same divine power that fills the cathedral itself. But you know better. You know that somewhere above, great wooden wheels are turning, weighted ropes are descending, and pins on a rotating drum are lifting levers in an order determined months ago by a craftsman with a file and a vision. And here, standing in the crowd, you notice something strange. The people around you are not just marveling at the clock. They are telling stories about it. They whisper that the figures move with intention, that the cock that crows at noon once saved the city from invaders, that the apostles turn to face the crowd because they know who watches. The line between mechanism and magic blurs in their telling, and you realize that these clocks are not just measuring time, they're creating wonder, feeding something in the human heart that craves the illusion of life in unliving things. The craftsmen who built them knew this, you suspect. They designed their figures not just to move but to seem, to appear as if something more than gears inhabited those painted wooden bodies. And in doing so, they prepared the ground for what comes next, for the moment when someone finally asks, if a machine can nod and bow and strike a bell, what else might it do? Could it play music? Could it write? Could it, perhaps, breathe? You follow the current of time forward again, or perhaps sideways, because history rarely flows in straight lines, and you find yourself swept into the gilded salons of Versailles, where Louis XIV holds court and where mechanical marvels have become the currency of wonder. The year is 1682, more or less, and the Sun King has recently moved his court into the vast palace he's been building for decades. You walk beside him through the Hall of Mirrors, though you're invisible, of course, a ghost from the future, and you watch as he pauses before a fountain powered not by gravity alone but by an enormous machine hidden in the gardens, a contraption of pumps and water wheels that lifts the Seine itself to feed the king's displays. Louis gestures at the water with a gloved hand, and you understand that for him, control over nature is control over everything. If he can make water defy its own weight, if he can make bronze horses seem to rear and spray, then he is indeed the Sun King, the center around which all France revolves. But you're not here for the fountains. You're here for something smaller, stranger, hidden in the private apartments where the king retreats when the court's endless performance exhausts even him. You follow him through a door that only a few are permitted to enter, and you find yourself in a room filled with clocks. Not ordinary clocks. These are musical clocks, astronomical clocks, clocks with dancing figures and singing birds and tiny landscapes that shift with the phases of the moon. Louis sinks into a chair and watches as one of his clockmakers wins a particularly elaborate piece, a gilded mountain dotted with silver sheep, a shepherd who raises his flute to his lips, and at the summit, a tiny castle where doors open to reveal mechanical courtiers bowing to a mechanical king. The clockmaker's hands move with practiced ease, setting weights and adjusting escapements, and when he releases the mechanism, the shepherd plays, the sheep nod, the courtiers bow, and Louis XIV, the most powerful man in Europe, smiles like a child on his birthday. This is the world that nurtures automata, a world where the display of wealth and power requires the display of wonder, where kings compete to own the most astonishing machines, where craftsmen are elevated from anonymous artisans to celebrated masters. You spend years in this room, watching as Louis acquires more and more mechanical treasures. A German craftsman brings him a silver peacock that fans its tail and turns its head. An Italian presents a miniature garden where flowers open and close with the hours. A Frenchman named Grolier de Cervy builds him a clock that shows the positions of all the known planets, their orbits adjusted by such fine gears that the mechanism will remain accurate for centuries. And each new acquisition pushes the boundaries of what clockwork can do. Each one requires new solutions to old problems. Each one plants another seed in the minds of the craftsmen who build them. You leave the king's apartments and wander through the palace's service corridors, following the scent of oil and brass dust to a small workshop where the royal clockmakers maintain their creations. Here you find a man named Isaac Thuret, who holds the official title of clockmaker to the king, and who spends his days coaxing recalcitrant mechanisms back into cooperation. Thuret is working on a small automaton of his own design, a figure of Diana the Huntress, complete with bow and arrow, who will draw her bowstring and release it when a hidden spring is triggered. The mechanism is delicate, frustrating. The string must release at exactly the right moment, the arrow must fly straight, the goddess must seem to aim with intention rather than accident. Thuret mutters to himself in French as he adjusts the tension, and you watch him file a tiny cam by candlelight, his breath held, his hands steady despite the late hour. What strikes you, standing there in the flickering light, is how much of this work is invisible. The courtiers who gasp at Diana's arrow will never see Thuret's workshop, never know the hours of filing and adjusting, never understand that their wonder is built on someone else's exhaustion. The king himself, for all his appreciation of fine craftsmanship, will never grasp the sheer accumulation of small genius required to make a mechanical goddess draw her bow. And yet Thuret doesn't seem to mind. He's solving problems that no one has solved before, pushing against the limits of what metal and spring can do, and that's enough. When he finally releases the catch and watches Diana's arm move smoothly, her arrow fly across the workbench to thud into a wooden target, he smiles the same smile you saw on Jean the clockmaker 2 centuries ago, the smile of a man who has made the impossible merely difficult. Historians still argue whether Louis XIV himself understood the deeper implications of the machines he collected. Some say he saw them simply as toys, expensive distractions in a palace full of expensive distractions. Others suggest that the Sun King, who understood power better than almost anyone, recognized that control over mechanism was control over nature itself, and that a king who could command a mechanical bird to sing might also command his subjects to dance. You suspect the truth lies somewhere in between, because Louis was many things: vain, ambitious, occasionally cruel. But he was also curious, genuinely interested in how things worked, and he spent hours with his clockmakers, asking questions, demanding explanations, pushing them to attempt what they had previously thought impossible. You watch him now, late at night, alone in his cabinet with a small musical box that plays a tune when opened. He winds it carefully, listens to the thin metallic melody, and wins it again. The box is simple compared to the great clocks in his collection, just a pinned cylinder lifting steel teeth, but it holds him nonetheless. Perhaps his thinking about the nature of time, about how this tiny mechanism captures and repeats a moment that would otherwise vanish forever. Perhaps he's just tired, and the music soothes him. You'll never know. But as you slip out of the palace and into the formal gardens where fountains sleep until morning, you carry with you the image of the most powerful man in Europe, alone with his toys, finding comfort in the gentle mechanics of a world he could never fully control. You leave Versailles behind and walk north, or perhaps east. The geography of dreams is flexible, until you find yourself in a workshop in Grenoble, the year now 1737, and standing before you is a man who will change everything. His name is Jacques de Vaucanson, and he is 38 years old, though he looks younger in the candlelight, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who has already failed enough times to know exactly what he's doing. The workshop around him holds the usual chaos of springs and gears and half-finished projects, but on the central bench, taking up most of the available space, lies something entirely new, a wooden figure the size of a living man, carved and painted to represent a flute player, its limbs jointed with leather and brass, its chest hollow, its lips pressed against the embouchure of a real wooden flute. You step closer, and Vaucanson glances up as if he senses your presence. But no, he's just checking the angle of the light, making sure he can see the delicate mechanism inside the figure's torso. You look where he looks, and you see the future. Rows of levers, each connected by wires to the figure's fingers. A complex arrangement of bellows and pipes where lungs should be. And most importantly, 3 separate sets of cams mounted on a rotating cylinder, each cam shaped to open and close specific air passages at specific moments, creating the precise sequence of notes that will emerge from the flute. Vaucanson reaches in with a pair of tweezers and adjusts one of the leather fingertips, making sure it will cover the flute's tone hole completely when the lever pushes it forward. He's been working on this figure for years, and tonight he will finally hear it play. You settle onto a stool in the corner, invisible, patient, as Vaucanson completes his final adjustments. He winds the mainspring with a heavy key, the ratchet clicking like a distant clock. He checks the bellows, making sure they are properly inflated. He positions the flute in the figure's hands, adjusting the angle until it's exactly right. And then, with a deep breath that you can hear across the room, he releases the mechanism. The figure's chest rises slightly as air flows from the bellows into its wooden lungs. Its fingers lift and fall across the flute's tone holes, each movement precise, each timing exact. And from the flute, impossibly, beautifully, comes music, a melody you recognize from the streets of Paris, played with a clarity and consistency no human musician could match. The figure's lips shape the air stream, its tongue articulates each note, its fingers dance across the silver keys, and Vaucanson watches with tears streaming down his face because he has done it. He has built a machine that breathes. The tune lasts perhaps a minute before the spring winds down, the bellows empty, the fingers still. Vaucanson stands in silence for a long moment, then walks to the figure and places his hand on its wooden cheek. "You played," he whispers. "You actually played." And you understand that this is not the triumph of a craftsman showing off his skills. This is something deeper, stranger, the moment when a man looks at his creation and sees, for the first time, the possibility that he might have made something that is almost alive. You spend the following weeks with Vaucanson as he prepares his flute player for public exhibition. He tells you his story in fragments, between adjustments and tests. Born in Grenoble, the 9th child of a glove maker, he showed an early fascination with mechanics. His first memory is of taking apart his mother's clock and failing to put it back together. Sent to study with the Jesuits, he secretly built mechanical figures in the attic, figures that moved and gestured and once, scandalously, bowed to a visiting bishop in a way that made the holy man cross himself and flee. Expelled for his impiety, because only God could create life, the Jesuits said, he wandered France, learning from clockmakers and instrument builders, until he found himself in Paris with a vision, to build an automaton that would not simply move, but perform. Not nod and bow, but play music with the same breath and finger work as a living flautist. The technical challenges were staggering. A human flute player does not simply blow air into the instrument. They shape their lips, control their breath pressure, articulate with their tongue, and move their fingers in precise coordination. Vaucanson had to replicate all of this with leather and springs. He studied anatomy, dissecting cadavers to understand how the lips and tongue work. He experimented with different materials for the fingers, finally settling on leather stretched over wire frames. He built and rebuilt the bellows system dozens of times, trying to achieve steady air pressure that wouldn't waver as the mechanism ran. And through it all, he fought the skepticism of everyone who heard about his project. Because a machine that plays the flute, they said, is impossible. Machines don't breathe. Machines don't have lips. Machines don't make music. But Vaucanson believed otherwise, and his belief carried him through years of failure. You watch him now, in the quiet evenings after the work is done, sitting beside his creation and talking to it as if it could understand. He tells it about his childhood, about his mother who died when he was young, about the brothers he left behind in Grenoble. He apologizes to it for the hours of adjustment, the constant tweaking, the way he's had to take it apart and put it back together so many times that the screw holes are starting to wear. And the figure sits silent, wooden, its glass eyes reflecting the candlelight, waiting for the next time someone wins its spring and sets its fingers dancing. Historians still argue whether Vaucanson considered his automata to be art or science, whether he saw himself as an artist or an engineer. The evidence suggests he didn't make the distinction. For him, the beauty of the music and the ingenuity of the mechanism were the same thing, two faces of the same achievement. When he finally unveiled the flute player in Paris, the crowds didn't care about categories. They came to see a miracle, and they found one. They watched the wooden figure raise the flute to its lips, heard the music flow from its mechanical lungs, and wondered whether they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of life. Vaucanson stood in the corner of the room, watching them watch his creation, and said nothing. He didn't need to. The flute player spoke for him. The success of the flute player makes Vaucanson famous, but fame is a hungry thing, and you follow him as it demands more. Paris buzzes with talk of the mechanical musician, and soon the invitations arrive, from nobles who want private viewings, from academies who want explanations, from kings who want their own automatons, only better, only more astonishing. Vaucanson accepts some and declines others, but you notice something shifting behind his eyes. The flute player was a dream fulfilled, but now the dream has become a standard, and standards must be exceeded. So he returns to his workshop, closes the shutters, and begins work on something that will make the flute player look like a child's toy. The year is 1738, and you watch Vaucanson's sketch designs that grow increasingly ambitious. A tambourine player, perhaps, with multiple percussion instruments. A pipe and drum player that could march. But none of these satisfy him, because none of them push far enough into the territory he's begun to explore. The territory where mechanism and life become difficult to distinguish. And then, one evening, he has an idea so audacious that he laughs out loud when it first occurs to him. He will build a duck. Not just any duck, a life-sized copper duck that will appear to eat, digest, and excrete grain. He will make the impossible literal. He will build a machine that mimics not just human art but the most fundamental of biological processes, the transformation of food into waste. And in doing so, he will force everyone who sees it to confront the question he's been circling for years. If a machine can eat and digest, what makes us so certain that we're not machines ourselves? You spend the next year in Vaucanson's workshop as he brings the duck to life. The project is absurdly complex. The duck must have a bill that opens and closes, a neck that stretches and retracts, wings that fold and unfold, and feet that paddle if placed in water. But the digestive system is the real challenge. Vaucanson designs a series of chambers inside the duck's body. One where the grain is stored after being swallowed, one where it's supposedly digested through chemical action, and one where the final product is collected for elimination. The grain never actually digests, of course. That would require a chemical process no 18th century craftsman could replicate, but the illusion is perfect. The duck takes grain in its bill, swallows, and after a suitable interval, excretes a pellet that looks convincingly like the real thing. The mechanism involves hidden compartments and sleight of hand worthy of a stage magician, but Vorkenson doesn't care about honesty. He cares about wonder. You watch him file the copper feathers one by one, each attached to a complex system of levers that will allow the wings to fold and unfold with the smooth motion of a living bird. He studies real ducks for hours, sketching their movements, noting how the neck curves when they preen, how the feet paddle in water. He builds and rebuilds the digestive chambers until the timing is perfect, until the grain disappears, waits exactly as long as a real digestion would take, and then emerges transformed. And through it all, he talks to the duck as he talked to the flute player, telling it stories, asking it questions, treating it as something between a pet and a god. The duck's public debut in 1739 causes a sensation that dwarfs the flute player's success. Crowds line up for hours to see the mechanical marvel, and when they finally enter the exhibition hall, they find Vorkenson's duck standing in a glass case, preening its copper feathers with mechanical precision. The performance begins with the duck stretching its neck and looking around the room, its glass eyes moving in a way that makes several spectators gasp. Then an assistant offers it a bowl of grain, and the duck bends its neck, opens its bill, and appears to swallow the offerings one by one. You stand at the back of the room, watching the faces in the crowd, and you see something you didn't expect, not just wonder, but unease. Because if a duck can eat, if a machine can perform the most basic of animal functions, then where is the line? What makes a living duck different from this copper imitation? The philosophers in the audience will debate this for decades, but the ordinary people in the room feel the question in their guts, and it disturbs them more than they can articulate. Voltaire himself hears of the duck and writes to a friend, "Without Vorkenson's duck, you would have nothing to remind you of the glory of France." It's a joke, of course, but like most of Voltaire's jokes, it contains a truth. The duck has become a symbol of French ingenuity, French artistry, French ability to create wonder from mechanism. And Vorkenson, suddenly the most famous craftsman in Europe, finds himself invited to courts across the continent, showing his duck to kings and queens who treat it as the eighth wonder of the world. But you notice something that the crowds don't see. Late at night, when the exhibitions are over and the last spectators have gone home, Vorkenson sits alone with his duck and speaks to it in a voice you've never heard him use before. "They think you're a marvel," he whispers. "They think you're the most amazing thing they've ever seen. But you're just gears, my friend. Just springs and levers and a little bit of copper. And sometimes I wonder if that's all I am too." He reaches out and touches the duck's bill, and for a moment, you see something in his eyes that looks almost like fear. He's built a machine that seems alive, and now he can't stop wondering whether the same might be true of himself. Historians still argue whether Vorkenson intended the duck as a philosophical statement or simply as a crowd-pleasing spectacle. The evidence suggests both, because Vorkenson was too intelligent not to see the implications of his own work, and too much of a showman not to exploit them. The duck's digestive system was a fraud. The grain never actually passed through chemical digestion, but the fraud was the point. It forced people to ask whether digestion was just another mechanical process, whether a machine that appeared to digest was functionally equivalent to a creature that actually did. And in asking that question, they found themselves on the edge of a much larger one, whether life itself might be just another form of mechanism, operating according to laws that human ingenuity might someday fully understand. The duck's fame echoes through France, but you turn away from the crowds and the philosophers and follow a different thread, one that leads south, toward the silk-weaving city of Lyon, where the year is now 1745 and something quieter but equally revolutionary is taking shape. You walk through narrow streets lined with workshops, past windows where weavers sit at their looms, their hands moving in patterns passed down through generations. The shuttles fly back and forth, carrying colored threads that build into brocades and damasks worth more than the houses they are woven in. But in one workshop, tucked away on a side street where the sun barely reaches, you find a man named Beausoleil Bouchin who is about to change everything without most people noticing. Bouchin's workshop looks like any other at first glance. A wooden loom dominates the space, its warp threads stretched vertically, waiting for the weft to pass between them. But as you step closer, you notice something strange. Above the warp, where the weaver's hands would normally lift selected threads to create the pattern, there's a mechanism you've never seen before, a series of needles positioned over a roll of perforated paper. Bouchin sits at the loom, not weaving but adjusting, and when he's satisfied, he pulls a lever. The paper advances, the needles drop through the perforations where they find them, and the warp threads lift in precisely the pattern the paper has encoded. The shuttle flies, the weft passes, and when Bouchin examines the emerging fabric, you see that the pattern is perfect, every thread exactly where it should be, every color precisely placed. You watch Bouchin work through the afternoon, and gradually you understand what you're seeing. The perforated paper is a program. The needles are readers. The loom is a machine that executes instructions written not in the weaver's memory but in the pattern of holes punched by an assistant following a painted grid. Bouchin's invention, simple as it seems, has separated the design of a textile from its production. Now a weaver doesn't need to remember the pattern, doesn't need to lift the correct threads by hand, doesn't need years of training to produce complex brocades. The paper remembers. The paper instructs. The paper, humble and perishable, holds the ghost of every pattern it has ever encoded. Bouchin shows you his workshop with the pride of someone who knows he's done something important, even if he's not entirely sure what. He's the son of an organ maker, he explains, and he learned from his father how pin cylinders could make music by opening valves at precise moments. It occurred to him that weaving was like music, a sequence of choices repeated over time, and that if pins on a cylinder could control airflow, they might also control thread. His first looms used pin cylinders like the ones in music boxes, but paper was cheaper, easier to change, more flexible. Now he can store dozens of patterns on rolls of paper, switching between them whenever he likes, producing fabrics that would have taken weeks to set up by traditional methods. You leave Bouchin's workshop and walk through Lyon, and suddenly you see looms everywhere, not the looms themselves, but their implications. Every patterned fabric you pass, every brocade on every noble's back, every damask hanging in every window, represents a pattern that had to be remembered, a sequence that had to be executed correctly thousands of times. The human brain is remarkable, but it's also fallible, and a single mistake in a complex pattern could ruin yards of expensive silk. Bouchin's punched paper doesn't make mistakes. It repeats the same instructions perfectly, every time, for as long as the paper holds together. And in that perfect repetition, you glimpse something that Bouchin himself probably doesn't see: the birth of automation, the first step toward machines that can be programmed to do anything, not just weave silk. A few years pass, and you return to Lyon to find that Bouchin's invention has been improved by his colleague Jean-Baptiste Falcon. Where Bouchin used a single roll of paper, Falcon has designed a system of punched cards linked together in a chain, each card representing a single row of the pattern, each card punched with holes that tell the loom which threads to lift. You watch Falcon's loom in operation, and the cards flick past like pages in a book, each one read by the needles, each one contributing its small piece to the emerging fabric. The sound is rhythmic, almost musical. The click of needles finding holes, the whoosh of the shuttle, the thump of the beater pressing the weft into place. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you hear an echo of something you haven't encountered yet. The click of relay switches in a computer, the whir of a hard drive, the silent processing of billions of instructions per second. Historians still argue whether Vaucanson knew about the Lyon loom makers, whether he saw the connection between his own punched cylinders and their punched cards. The timing is suggestive. Vaucanson was appointed inspector of silk manufactures in 1741, charged with improving French textile production, and he certainly visited Lyon during his tenure. You imagine him standing exactly where you're standing now, watching Falcon's loom click through its cards, and you wonder whether he recognized what he was seeing. The punched cards that controlled the loom were cousins to the pinned cylinders that controlled his flute player. Both stored information. Both repeated sequences. Both separated the design from the execution. And both, in their different ways, pointed toward a future where machines wouldn't just move but remember, wouldn't just act but follow instructions written by human hands. The silk that emerges from Falcon's loom is beautiful, a pattern of flowers and leaves in gold and crimson, woven so finely that the design seems to float on the fabric surface. You reach out to touch it, and your fingers meet threads that were positioned by holes punched in cards, threads that followed instructions written months ago by a designer who never touched the loom. The fabric doesn't know it was programmed. It doesn't care. It just is what it is, beautiful and precise, a testament to the power of storing information in a form machines can read. And as you stand there in the Lyon workshop, listening to the loom's patient rhythm, you realize that you're watching the ghost of every future computer take its first hesitant breath. You leave Lyon and its clicking looms behind, but the sound of punched cards follows you north, toward the Swiss border, toward a city called La Chaux-de-Fonds nestled in the Jura Mountains where the winters are long and the nights are even longer, and where the quiet has a way of turning men's minds toward intricate things. The year is 1774, and you're walking through streets lined with watchmakers' workshops, each one lit by candles that burn well past midnight, each one filled with the tiny sounds of craftsmen coaxing brass and steel into instruments that will measure time for people they'll never meet. But one workshop draws you forward, its windows glowing warmer than the others, and when you step inside, you find Pierre Jaquetros bent over a bench, his breath visible in the cold air, his hands working on something that makes your chest tighten with recognition. It's the boy. The writing boy you stood before in the museum, though here he's not finished yet, not dressed in his faded crimson silk, not protected by glass. Here he lies on the workbench like a patient undergoing surgery, his chest open, his brass organs exposed to the candlelight. Jaquetros is adjusting the camshaft that runs through his torso, filing one of the lobes by a fraction of a millimeter, checking the fit against a lever that will translate its rotation into the movement of a tiny brass finger. Beside him on the bench, arranged in careful order, are the other cams, 40 of them, each one shaped to produce a specific character when the mechanism runs. The boy will be able to write any text of up to 40 characters, Jaquetros explains to an assistant who hovers nearby, by rearranging the cams on their cylinder. 40 characters, the length of a short sentence, a line of poetry, a child's prayer. 40 characters, each one requiring hours of filing and testing to get exactly right. You settle into the shadows and watch Jaquetros work through the night. He's a handsome man in his mid-50s, with steady hands and the kind of patience that comes only from decades of failed experiments. Born into a family of watchmakers, he showed early talent and was sent to study in Paris, where he encountered the automata of Vaucanson and decided that watches, however beautiful, were not enough. He wanted to build things that moved, that seemed to think, that blurred the line between mechanism and life. Returning to Switzerland, he established a workshop with his son Henri Louis and his adopted son Jean-Frédéric Lechaud, and together they began work on what would become the most famous automata in history: the writer, the draftsman, and the musician. The writer is Jaquetros' masterpiece, and he knows it. As you watch, he fits a new cam onto the cylinder and rotates it slowly by hand, watching the levers rise and fall in sequence. The boy's hand lifts, moves to the right, dips slightly as if touching paper, then lifts again. It's not writing yet, the quill isn't even in place, but the pattern is there, the sequence of movements that will become letters when combined with the mechanisms that control the ink flow and the paper advance. Jacquet Droz makes a small adjustment to one of the levers, then rotates the cylinder again. This time the movement is smoother, more natural, closer to the flowing motion of a human hand. He nods, satisfied, and reaches for the next cam. You spend weeks in the workshop, watching the automaton take shape. The boy's head is porcelain, painted by an artist who specializes in miniature portraits, and the face that emerges is specific, individual, not a generic child but a particular one, with a slight asymmetry to the features that makes him seem almost real. His eyes are glass, mounted on tiny springs so they can move, and when Jacquet Droz fits them into the sockets and adjusts the connecting rods, you realize with a start that the boy will be able to look around the room, will seem to notice the people watching him. His chest rises and falls with simulated breath, powered by a small bellows that creates the illusion of life. And his hand, his perfect tiny hand, has joints at every knuckle, each one articulated so precisely that the fingers can grip the quill with exactly the right pressure. The mechanism inside the boy's torso is a marvel of compact engineering. 3 separate systems operate simultaneously. One controls the hand movements, one controls the eye movements and breathing, and one advances the paper and regulates the ink flow. All are powered by a single mainspring, carefully regulated by an escapement that ensures everything happens at exactly the right moment. The heart of the system is the camshaft, a cylinder covered with raised lobes that push against levers as it rotates. Each cam corresponds to a single character, and by rearranging them on the shaft, you can make the boy write any sequence of up to 40 letters or symbols. It's programming, pure and simple, executed in brass and steel 2 centuries before anyone coined the term. Jacquet Droz finishes the mechanism and begins the long process of testing. He loads the camshaft with a sequence that spells out a simple sentence in French. Les automates ne sont pas des jouets. Automata are not toys. He wins the mainspring, positions the boy at his desk, and releases the catch. The mechanism whirs softly, the boy's chest rises, his eyes sweep the room, and his hand lifts the quill, dips it in the ink, and begins to move across the paper. The letters form slowly, each one taking shape with the deliberation of a child learning to write. When the sentence is complete, the boy's hand returns the quill to its holder and his eyes come to rest on some middle distance, as if waiting for the next instruction. Jacquet Droz picks up the paper and reads what his creation has written. For a long moment, he says nothing. Then he places the paper carefully on the bench and walks to the window, where he stands looking out at the snow-covered mountains, his back to the room, his shoulders shaking slightly. Historians still argue whether Jacquet Droz considered his automata to be art or engineering, whether he saw them as demonstrations of skill or as philosophical statements. The truth, you suspect, is simpler and more complicated. He built them because he could, because the challenge consumed him, because the moment when a machine first writes a sentence you've given it is unlike anything else in human experience. That moment, the moment when your creation does something you taught it to do, something that seems to require thought and intention, is a kind of miracle, even if you know exactly how it works. And Jacquet Droz, standing at that window with his back to the room, is experiencing that miracle for the first time. He will spend the rest of his life trying to recapture it. The writer is complete, but Jacquet Droz's workshop hums with continued purpose because one miracle demands another, and you watch as the craftsmen turn their attention to the second automaton in what will become a legendary trio. The year is still 1774, though the seasons have shifted, and snow now blankets the Jura Mountains while inside the workshop. Candles burn against the darkness and hands shape something new. This time it's a figure of a young woman, seated at a small organ, her fingers poised above the keys, her body still, waiting. You recognize the face from somewhere, Perhaps a portrait you saw in a gallery. Perhaps a memory of someone Jacquet Droz loved and lost. The porcelain cheeks are painted with the same care as the writer's, the eyes the same glass, the same hint of a mechanism that will make them follow you across the room. But this figure holds something the writer doesn't, an instrument, and the promise of music. You watch Jean-Frédéric Lechaud, Jacquet Droz's adopted son, as he fits the final connections between the organ's keys and the figure's fingers. The mechanism is even more complex than the writer's because music requires timing, coordination, the precise moment when a finger presses a key and air flows through the corresponding pipe. Inside the figure's torso, a pinned cylinder rotates slowly, its brass teeth lifting levers that connect to each finger by delicate wires. The cylinder is longer than the writer's camshaft, carrying not 40 instructions but thousands, each pin positioned to create a specific note at a specific moment. Lechaud has spent months calculating the placements, transferring musical scores into patterns of metal that will repeat forever, or until the spring runs down. The musician, as she will be called, is not a generic figure. She has personality, presence, the suggestion of a soul behind those glass eyes. Her dress is silk, embroidered with flowers by the same hands that painted her cheeks. Her hair is real human hair, carefully styled and pinned. And her expression, captured in porcelain, holds a slight smile that makes you wonder what she's thinking, what music she hears in that silent space between performances. When Lechaud wins the spring and releases the catch, her chest rises with simulated breath, her eyes move slowly across the room as if gathering an audience, and her fingers descend to the keys. The organ plays, a simple melody, nothing too ambitious for a first test, and the notes fill the workshop with something that sounds like magic but is only mathematics, only pins and levers and the patient application of force. You stand beside the musician as she plays, close enough to see the mechanism working behind her eyes, the tiny cams that make her gaze shift from left to right and back again. The effect is disorienting because she seems to see you, seems to acknowledge your presence even as her fingers continue their programmed dance across the keys. You step to the left, and her eyes follow. You step to the right, and they follow still. There's no intelligence behind that gaze, no recognition, only a clever arrangement of levers and springs. But knowing this doesn't prevent the chill that runs down your spine when those glass eyes meet yours and hold for just a moment before moving on. The third automaton, the draftsman, takes shape beside the musician over the following months. This figure is a boy again, younger than the writer, seated at a desk with paper and pencil. His mechanism is similar to the writer's but simpler. Instead of forming letters, he draws pictures, a dog, a cupid, a portrait of Louis XVI that Jacquet Droz includes as a political gesture. The camshaft in his chest carries not character cams but continuous profiles that guide his hand through the complex motions of drawing. When he works, his eyes follow his pencil, watching the lines appear as if he's checking his work, as if he might correct a mistake. He never does, of course. The drawings emerge exactly the same every time, perfect copies of images Jacquet Droz encoded in brass months before. The three automata are completed together, and you watch as they are prepared for their first public exhibition. Jacquet Droz has spent a fortune on them, years of labor, materials imported from across Europe, fees to the artists who painted the faces and embroidered the clothes. He needs to recoup his investment, and more than that, he needs the world to see what he's accomplished. So in the spring of 1774, he loads the figures onto specially constructed crates and begins the journey to Paris, where the court and the academies await. The exhibition is held in a rented hall near the Palais Royal, and you stand among the crowd on opening night, watching the faces of the spectators as they encounter the automata for the first time. The writer goes first, his mechanism wound, his sentence programmed. Je pense donc je suis, I think, therefore I am. It's Descartes, of course, the most famous philosophical statement of the age, and when the little boy's hand forms those words on paper, you hear gasps from the crowd, murmurs of wonder and unease. A machine that writes Descartes. A machine that quotes the philosopher who asked whether we can be certain of anything except our own thoughts. The irony is not lost on the philosophers in the audience, and you see several of them exchange glances that suggest sleepless nights ahead. The musician plays next, her fingers moving across the keys with a precision no human could match, her eyes roaming the room as if she's playing for each person individually. The melody is by Gluck, fashionable and complex, and when she finishes, the applause is genuine, enthusiastic, the applause of people who have forgotten for a moment that they are applauding a machine. Then the draftsman draws his dog, his pencil moving in short, confident strokes, his eyes following every line, and when he finishes and sets down his pencil, someone in the crowd begins to cry. You watch Jacquet draws through the evening, standing in the corner of the room, accepting congratulations with the modesty of someone who knows his work speaks for itself. But you notice something else, something the crowd doesn't see. When the last spectator has left and the candles burn low, Jacquet draws approaches each automaton in turn, winding their springs, setting them in motion one last time. The writer writes his sentence. The musician plays her melody. The draftsman draws his dog. And Jacquet draws watches them work, his face lit by the flickering candles. And you understand that he's not checking for errors or testing the mechanisms. He's saying goodbye. These figures that have lived in his workshop for years, that have received his attention and care and countless small adjustments, are leaving now. They belong to the world. They will never be his alone again. The exhibition ends, the crowds disperse, and you find yourself alone in the hall with the automata, the candles burned low, the shadows long. The writer sits at his desk, his hand frozen mid-gesture above the quill. The musician leans slightly toward her organ, her fingers resting on the keys. The draftsman gazes at his completed drawing, his pencil still, his eyes fixed on something you can't see. And as you stand there in the silence, you feel the question that has haunted every spectator who has ever encountered these machines press against your consciousness like a hand against a window. Are they alive? Not alive in the way you're alive, not breathing and thinking and feeling in the messy human way, but alive in some other sense, alive in the way a poem is alive, or a melody, or a memory that refuses to fade. You step closer to the writer and look into his glass eyes. They are beautiful, those eyes, painted with such care that the irises seem to hold depths, seem to reflect light in a way that suggests awareness. A tiny mechanism connects them to the mainspring, so that when the automaton operates, they move slowly from side to side, scanning the room as if searching for someone. But now, in the stillness, they are fixed on a point somewhere to your left, and you find yourself stepping into their line of sight, testing whether the illusion holds from every angle. It does. From here, the writer seems to look directly at you, seems to acknowledge your presence in a way that makes your skin prickle despite everything you know about cams and levers and the careful arrangement of brass. This is the heart of it, you realize, the reason these machines have drawn crowds and sparked debates for centuries. They're not just clever toys, not just demonstrations of mechanical skill. They are mirrors. They reflect back to us our own questions about what it means to be alive, to think, to feel, to be. When you watch the writer form letters with his tiny brass fingers, you're watching something that looks like thought made visible. When the musician's eyes follow you across the room, you're experiencing something that feels like recognition. And when the draftsman completes his drawing and sets down his pencil, you're witnessing something that seems like intention, like the satisfaction of a job well done. The philosophers of the 18th century wrestle with these questions in candlelit rooms far from here, and you visit some of them as the years pass. In Paris, you sit in on a salon hosted by Denis Diderot, where the conversation turns to Vaucanson's duck and whether a machine that appears to digest can be said to truly digest. Diderot argues that it cannot, that digestion requires organic processes no mechanism can replicate. But another guest, the mathematician Jean Le Rond d'Alembert, disagrees, suggesting that if we don't know exactly how digestion works in living creatures, we can't be certain a machine isn't doing something equivalent. The debate grows heated, wine is spilled, and you slip out into the night with the questions still unresolved. In Geneva, you visit the philosopher and writer Voltaire, who has followed the automata debates with his characteristic blend of amusement and insight. He's old now, nearing the end of his life, but his mind remains sharp, and he receives you in his study surrounded by books and papers and a small mechanical bird in a cage that sings when wound. The automata are the most honest creatures in France, he tells you with a thin smile. They do exactly what they are designed to do, nothing more, nothing less. Can you say the same of any human you've met? You can't, of course, and you leave Voltaire's study wondering whether honesty is the right standard for life, whether a machine that never lies is somehow more or less alive than a human who lies constantly. The most troubling questions come from a surprising source, a young woman named Émilie du Châtelet, a mathematician and physicist who has translated Newton's works into French and who corresponds with the leading thinkers of Europe. You find her in her chateau in eastern France, surrounded by scientific instruments and half-finished manuscripts, and she greets you with the directness that made her both admired and feared in intellectual circles. The automata force us to ask what we mean by life, she says, gesturing at a small mechanical figure on her desk, a gift from Jacquet Droz, a miniature version of the writer that spells out short messages. If life is simply the ability to move and respond to stimuli, then many machines are alive. If life requires consciousness, then we can't prove that anyone except ourselves possesses it. The automata don't solve the problem. They make it impossible to ignore. You spend weeks with du Châtelet, watching her work on her mathematical treatises, discussing the implications of the automata for everything from physics to theology. She shows you her calculations on the nature of force and energy, and you begin to see connections you never noticed before. The way a spring stores potential energy, the way an escapement releases it in measured beats, the way a cam translates rotation into linear motion. These are not just mechanical principles, you realize. They are metaphors for everything. The universe itself, du Châtelet suggests, might be a kind of automaton, wound by God at the beginning of time and left to run according to laws that human reason can discover. The thought is both comforting and terrifying, comforting because it suggests order beneath apparent chaos, terrifying because it suggests that we too might be following programs we didn't write. Historians still argue whether the 18th century automata influenced the development of later ideas about artificial life and machine intelligence. Some say the connection is obvious, that Vaucanson's duck and Jacquet Droz's writer are direct ancestors of modern robots and computers. Others insist the gap is too wide, that automata were entertainment, not research, and that their philosophical implications were mostly in the minds of spectators. You suspect both views miss something essential. The automata weren't ancestors of modern machines in any direct technical sense. Their mechanisms led nowhere, their principles were forgotten and rediscovered later. But they were ancestors of a certain way of thinking, a certain willingness to ask whether the line between mechanism and life might be thinner than we assumed. And that way of thinking, once unleashed, could never be fully contained. The philosophical debates continue in salons and academies, but you turn away from words and return to the workshop, because the automata themselves have more to teach you than any philosopher could. The year is 1775, and you find yourself back in La Chose-de-Fonds, standing outside a modest building that has become, without anyone quite noticing, the epicenter of the mechanical world. Pierre Jacquet Droz has returned from Paris with money and fame, and he's using both to expand his workshop, taking on new apprentices, commissioning new tools, pushing his craft further than anyone has pushed it before. You duck through the low doorway and enter a space that smells of oil and brass dust and the faint sweetness of wood shavings, and you stop dead at what you see. The workshop is alive with automata. Not finished ones, not the polished figures that draw crowds in Paris, but pieces, fragments, experiments in various stages of completion. A row of porcelain heads sits on a shelf, their glass eyes staring at nothing, their painted expressions ranging from serene to slightly alarmed. Mechanical hands lie on the workbench like severed limbs, their brass fingers curled into gestures that might mean anything. A half-finished bird, its copper feathers still unpolished, hangs from a stand by its single completed wing. And everywhere, covering every surface, are gears. Gears in wooden trays, gears strung on wires, gears scattered across blueprints like fallen coins. You've stepped into the mind of a man who cannot stop creating, who sees every problem as an invitation, every limitation as a challenge. Jean-Frédéric Lechaud looks up from the bench where he's working and nods in your direction as if he's been expecting you. He's younger than Jacques Droz, perhaps 30, with the intense focus of someone who learned his craft at the knee of a master and has already begun to surpass him in certain respects. The project before him is ambitious, a mechanical figure that will do something no automaton has ever done before. Not write, not draw, not play music, those are old news now. This figure will dance. It will move across a stage, turning and gesturing and responding to music played by another automaton, creating the illusion of partnership, of interaction, of something that looks almost like relationship. You watch Lechaud work on the dancer's legs, fitting hip joints that allow rotation as well as forward and backward motion. The mechanism is fiendishly complex because walking requires balance, weight shifting, coordination between multiple limbs. A human dancer doesn't think about these things. They've learned them so thoroughly that the movements have become automatic. But a machine has to be taught every detail, every tiny adjustment, through the careful shaping of cams and the precise adjustment of levers. Lechaud has been working on this single figure for over a year, and he estimates he has at least another year to go. He doesn't seem bothered by the timeline. In fact, he seems to relish it, to savor the daily challenge of solving problems no one has solved before. Across the room, Pierre Jacques is working on something that makes you catch your breath. It's a small child, no taller than your knee, dressed in simple clothes and holding a slate. But as you step closer, you see that the child's eyes are following you, not with the simple back and forth motion of the earlier automata, but with a more complex pattern, tracking your movement continuously, adjusting for distance and angle. Jacques Droz has built a mechanism that simulates visual attention, that makes the figure seem to watch you no matter where you stand. He looks up as you approach and smiles, a craftsman's smile, pleased with his work and happy to show it off. "Watch this," he says, and he positions himself to the figure's left. The eyes follow him. He moves to the right, and they follow still. He walks slowly around the figure, and the eyes track him all the way, only returning to center when he stops moving. The mechanism uses 3 separate cams, he explains, one for horizontal movement, one for vertical, and one that coordinates them based on the perceived distance of the viewer. It's not vision, of course. It can't recognize you or respond to anything except motion. But it's enough. When people see these eyes following them, they forget it's a machine. They start to feel seen. You spend months in the workshop, watching the craftsmen at work, learning their techniques, absorbing their philosophy. The days have a rhythm. Mornings are for fine adjustments, when the light is best and hands are steady. Afternoons are for rough work, cutting gears and shaping cams. Evenings are for testing, when the mechanisms are wound and set in motion and problems are identified for the next morning's adjustments. Through it all, the conversation flows, about materials and techniques, about customers and commissions, about the philosophical questions that never quite go away. Is what we're doing art or engineering? Does it matter? Will these machines outlast us? And if they do, what will they mean to people who never knew we existed? One evening, late, when the others have gone home and the workshop is lit only by a single candle, you find Jacquette draws alone with the child automaton, its eyes following him as he paces slowly back and forth. He's been drinking, you realize. There's an empty bottle on the bench and a glass in his hand, and his usual reserve has softened into something more vulnerable. They think I'm a genius, he says to the figure, or to you, or to no one. They think I understand something they don't. But I don't understand anything. I just file brass until it does what I want. I just keep trying things until they work. And sometimes they work, and people call me a genius, and I go home and lie awake wondering when they'll find out how ordinary I really am. The child's eyes follow him as he paces, and for a moment, the illusion is complete. The figure seems to listen, seems to care, seems to offer the silent attention that Jacquette draws needs in this moment of doubt. He stops pacing and looks at it, really looks, and you see something shift in his expression. You're the only one who understands, he whispers, and you can't tell whether he's joking. Probably he can't tell either. The line between creator and creation, between the man who built the machine and the machine that seems to understand him, has blurred in the candlelight, and neither of them knows anymore where one ends and the other begins. Morning light filters through the workshop windows, and you find yourself drawn back to the figure that started this journey. The writer, returned from his Paris triumph and resting now in a corner of the workshop while Jacquette draws prepares him for the next exhibition. You approach the mechanical boy slowly, the way you might approach a sleeping child, and you lean over his shoulder to examine the mechanism that lets him write any message you choose. His brass skull is open, revealing the camshaft that runs through his chest like a spine, and you trace the intricate mathematics hidden inside with your eyes, trying to understand how 40 carefully shaped lobes of metal can encode the entire alphabet. The camshaft is the writer's brain, and like a human brain, it's more complex than it appears. Each of the 40 cams is removable, interchangeable, designed to be rearranged on the shaft in any order. Each cam has a specific profile, a pattern of rises and falls that pushes against levers connected to the writer's hand, arm, and fingers. When the shaft rotates, the cams lift their levers in sequence, and the levers translate those lifts into the precise movements required to form letters. A cam for the letter A looks different from a cam for the letter B, and a skilled operator can program the writer to produce any message of up to 40 characters simply by arranging the cams in the correct order and securing them on the shaft with a small set screw. You reach out and touch one of the cams, running your finger along its carefully filed surface. The brass is cool, smooth, marked with tiny file marks that testify to the hours Jacquette draws spent getting it exactly right. Each cam had to be tested repeatedly, fitted against the levers it would lift, adjusted and readjusted until the movement it produced matched the curve of a human letter. The letter S, you notice, requires a complex sequence of movements: down, curve, up, curve again, and the cam that produces it has a correspondingly complex profile, with multiple rises and falls that must occur in exactly the right order. Jacquette draws didn't just file these cams by eye. He calculated them, measured them, translated the flowing curves of handwriting into the angular language of brass. Jacquette draws joins you at the bench, holding a cup of coffee that steams in the cold morning air. He sees you examining the cams and nods, understanding your fascination. Each one takes about a week to make, he says, assuming I don't make mistakes. The profile has to be perfect. An error of a few hundredths of a millimeter will make the letter illegible, or cause the quill to press too hard and tear the paper. I've thrown away dozens of cams that were almost right but not quite. Almost right isn't good enough for something that has to work perfectly every time for centuries. He sets down his coffee and removes one of the cams from the shaft, handing it to you. It's heavier than you expected, and the profile is more complex than you realized. Not just a simple bump but a series of subtle variations, each one corresponding to a different phase of the letter's formation. Jacquet-Droz explains that each cam actually controls multiple movements: the horizontal position of the arm, the vertical position of the hand, the pressure of the quill on the paper, even the angle of the wrist. All of this information is encoded in the single rotating surface of the cam, translated through levers into the complex choreography of writing. It's programming at its most fundamental, information stored in physical form, waiting to be read by the machine that will execute it. You spend the morning watching Jacquet-Droz program the writer for a new message. The client is a wealthy nobleman who wants the automaton to write a love letter to his wife, 40 characters of devotion that will be performed at a private gathering. Jacquet-Droz consults a chart that maps each cam to its corresponding letter, then begins selecting cams from the storage box and arranging them on the shaft in order. The process is methodical, almost meditative. Pick a cam, check its marking, slide it onto the shaft, secure it with the set screw, move to the next. When all 40 cams are in place, he rotates the shaft manually, watching the levers rise and fall, checking that the sequence produces something that looks like the intended message. Satisfied, he wings the mainspring and releases the catch. The writer comes to life, his chest rising, his eyes scanning the room, his hand lifting the quill and dipping it in ink. The quill moves to the paper and begins to write, forming letters in the elegant script that Jacquet-Droz taught him years ago. You lean close to read the words as they appear. Mon cœur n'est pas que pour toi, ma chère. My heart beats only for you, my dear. 40 characters exactly, each one formed with the precision that only a machine can achieve, each one carrying the weight of a message that will be performed, witnessed, applauded, and forgotten within the hour. The writer finishes, returns his quill to its holder, and falls still, his eyes fixed on some middle distance, waiting for the next message, the next performance, the next century. You think about what this means, that a machine can be programmed to express love, can produce words that would make a human heart flutter, without feeling anything itself. The nobleman's wife will watch the performance, will read the words formed by brass fingers, will perhaps be moved by the sentiment even though she knows the sentiment comes from her husband, not from the machine. The writer is just a messenger, a medium, a way of transmitting human feeling across time and space. But standing here, watching him write, it's hard not to feel that something more is happening, that the machine itself participates in the act of communication, that its perfect letters carry something of the care Jacquet-Droz invested in their creation. Historians still argue whether Jacquet-Droz understood the full implications of his programmable automaton. Some say he was simply a craftsman, interested in solving technical problems, unconcerned with philosophy. Others point to the messages he chose for his demonstrations. Descartes, Voltaire, lines of poetry that raise questions about consciousness and identity, and suggest he knew exactly what he was doing. You suspect the truth is somewhere in between, because Jacquet-Droz was both craftsman and thinker, both engineer and artist, and the line between those categories was as blurry for him as it is for you. He built the writer because he could, because the challenge excited him, because the moment when a machine first wrote a human sentence was unlike anything else he'd ever experienced. The implications could wait. The wonder was enough for now. The writer falls still, his message complete, and you turn from the workshop toward something lighter, something that shows you another face of these mechanical marvels. The year is 1780, and you find yourself in Paris again, but not in the salons or academies where philosophers debate the nature of life and consciousness. Instead, you're standing in the glittering townhouse of a wealthy young nobleman, the Comte de something or other, whose name doesn't matter because what matters is the gift he's about to present to his beloved. You follow him through rooms filled with gilded furniture and mirrors that multiply the candlelight, until you reach a small salon where a woman waits, her face hidden by a fan, her posture a careful performance of indifference. The Comte carries a velvet-lined box, and when he opens it, you see what's inside: a tiny silver bird, no larger than your thumb, perched on a gilded branch inside a jeweled cage. The bird's feathers are engraved with astonishing detail, each one catching the light as the Comte turns the box to show his beloved. She lowers her fan, and her eyes widen because she recognizes what this is: not just a piece of jewelry, not just a decorative object, but one of the singing bird automata that have become the most coveted love tokens in all of France. The Comte wins a tiny key hidden in the base of the cage, and the bird comes to life. It flutters its wings, turns its head, opens its beak, and sings, a cascade of notes so pure and sweet that the woman's hand flies to her mouth and tears start in her eyes. You watch the scene unfold, and you understand that this tiny machine is saying something the Comte cannot say in words. It says, "I would give you the impossible." It says, "I would capture the sky for you if I could." It says, "My love is as intricate and enduring as this mechanism, as carefully crafted, as capable of producing beauty forever." The woman reaches out and touches the cage, and the bird continues to sing, oblivious to her touch, following a program written months ago by a craftsman who will never know whose heart his creation just won. The singing bird automaton has a history almost as old as the automaton itself, but it reaches its peak in the late 18th century, when Swiss and French craftsmen perfect the art of miniaturization. The mechanism inside that tiny silver bird is a miracle of compression, a miniature bellows to power the song, a pinned cylinder to encode the melody, a complex system of levers to move the wings and beak and tail, all contained within a space smaller than your thumb. The craftsmen who build these marvels spend years learning their trade, years that could be spent building full-sized automata that would draw crowds and make fortunes. But they build the singing birds anyway, because the birds sell, because the birds are the perfect gift for occasions when words fail, because the birds allow the wealthy to express feelings they've been taught to hide. You leave the Comte and his beloved and follow the birds back to their source, to the workshops where they are created by the hundreds. In Geneva, you find a craftsman named Jean-Georges Ramond who specializes in these miniature marvels, his workshop filled with tiny gears and even tinier springs, his magnifying glass never leaving his eye. Ramond shows you a bird he's just completed, a goldfinch this time, its feathers enameled in red and yellow, its eyes tiny chips of ruby. He wins it and sets it on the bench, and it sings a melody you recognize from the streets of Geneva, a folk tune that children sing and lovers hum and old men whistle while they work. The bird's mechanism will repeat that tune 50,000 times before the spring needs rewinding, will sing it exactly the same way every time, will never forget a note or miss a beat. Ramond watches it with the satisfaction of a job well done, then turns back to his bench to begin the next one. The singing birds become a language of their own, a way of communicating that transcends words. A young man gives one to his intended as a proposal, the bird's song saying what his trembling voice cannot. A husband gives one to his wife on the birth of their child, the bird's fluttering wings echoing the new life in their home. A father gives one to a daughter leaving for a convent, the bird's song a reminder of the world she's leaving behind, a promise that she will be remembered. Each bird carries the same mechanism, the same tune, the same programmed performance. But each one means something different because of who gives it and who receives it, because of the context that surrounds the gift, because of the love that wins the spring and sets the song in motion. You spend weeks among the bird makers, learning their craft, understanding their world. They are a secretive lot, these craftsmen, guarding their techniques with the jealousy of magicians protecting their tricks. But they warm to you eventually, showing you the special tools they've invented, the alloys they've developed, the tiny tricks that make their birds sing more sweetly or flutter more naturally. One old craftsman, his hands shaking with age, shows you a bird he built 50 years ago, when he was young and in love and wanted to give his beloved something that would last longer than he would. She died decades ago, but the bird still sings, still flutters, still opens its beak and pours out the melody he chose for her when they were both young and the world seemed infinite. He wins it and listens, and you see in his face that the bird has become something more than a machine, more than a memory. It has become a presence, a companion, a voice from across the years that still speaks his name. Historians still argue whether these miniature automata should be considered art or craft, whether they deserve the same attention as the great figures of Vaucanson and Jacquet-Droz. The craftsmen themselves don't care about the distinction. They build the birds because people want them, because the birds create moments of wonder and joy, because watching a lover's face light up when the bird begins to sing is worth all the years of training and all the hours of meticulous labor. The birds are humble things, really, just gears and springs and a little bit of enamel. But they carry love across time, across distance, across the silence that separates one human heart from another. And that, you think, is as close to magic as mechanism will ever come. The birds sing on, but their melodies grow faint as the air around you changes, thickens with something you can't quite name. The year is 1789, and you're walking through the streets of Paris on a July morning, and everything is different. The shops are shuttered, the streets are empty, and in the distance you hear a sound that might be cheering or might be screaming. It's hard to tell the difference anymore. You follow the sound toward the center of the city, toward places you've walked before, and what you find makes you stop and press yourself against a wall, invisible, watching. The crowd is enormous, stretching across the Place de Grève and spilling into every side street. They are not the elegant crowds you've seen at automata exhibitions, not the philosophers and nobles and wealthy merchants who debated the nature of life in candlelit salons. These are the people of Paris, the ones who've gone hungry while their kings played, who've watched their children die while nobles danced, who've finally decided that they've had enough. They carry pikes and torches and the severed heads of men who were powerful yesterday and are nothing today. And in their midst, you see something that makes your stomach turn, a mechanical figure, one of the automata you've come to love, being dragged through the streets like a criminal. It's a small figure, a child musician from some noble's collection, its porcelain face smeared with mud, its delicate clothing torn, its mechanism shattered by the rough handling. The crowd doesn't know or care what it is. They see only a toy of the rich, a symbol of the excess they've risen to destroy. Someone swings a hammer at its head, and the porcelain shatters, revealing the brass mechanism inside, the gears and springs that once made music now exposed to the air like spilled organs. The crowd cheers, and the figure is dropped, trampled, forgotten as they move on to the next target. You follow them, because you have to know, because the automata you've spent so long with are somewhere in this city and you need to see what becomes of them. The mob moves through the streets with the terrible purpose of people who've decided that destruction is the only language power understands. They break into townhouses and drag out furniture, paintings, anything that belonged to the aristocrats who've fled or been arrested. And sometimes, in the midst of the wreckage, you see an automaton, a singing bird in a jeweled cage, a mechanical dancer on a gilded stand, a flute player who will never breathe again. Some are smashed immediately, their brass bodies scattered across cobblestones. Others are carried away as trophies, soon to meet the same fate. A few, you notice, are hidden by servants who've grown fond of them, carried to attics and cellars where they might survive the chaos. You find yourself outside the workshop where Jacquet-Droz once exhibited his automata, and your heart sinks. The door hangs open, broken from its hinges, and inside you hear the sounds of destruction. You step through the doorway and into a scene from a nightmare. The writer lies on his side on the floor, his porcelain face cracked, his arm torn from its socket, his brass chest crushed by a boot. The musician is beside him, her organ smashed, her fingers scattered across the floor like fallen petals. The draftsman has been thrown against a wall and lies in pieces, his drawings trampled into the dust. And standing over them, breathing hard, is a man in a worker's smock, a hammer still in his hand, his face a mixture of triumph and something that looks almost like regret. He sees you watching and shrugs, a gesture that says, "What have you got against me? What do you know about my life, my hunger, my dead children? They were just toys," he says, "though you're not there, though you're invisible, though he's really talking to himself. Just toys for the rich. Let them play with something else for a change." He drops the hammer and walks out, leaving you alone with the ruins of 100 years of work, with the bodies of creatures that were never alive but somehow seemed to be, with the silence where music used to play. You kneel beside the writer and touch his cracked cheek, and you feel something you didn't expect: grief. Not for the loss of art or craft or historical treasure, though those losses are real. Grief for this particular creature, this small brass being that wrote Descartes and love letters and messages you'll never know, that sat in its glass case and moved its eyes and made people wonder whether they were alone in the universe. The writer is dead now, truly dead in a way it never was when it simply sat silent between performances. Its mechanism is broken beyond repair, its program lost, its 40 cams scattered across the floor where they'll be swept up and thrown away by whoever cleans this mess. It will never write again. It will never make anyone wonder again. It's just brass now, just scrap, just a memory of something that mattered. But even as you grieve, you notice something. Not all the automata are destroyed. In the corner of the workshop, half hidden under a fallen shelf, you see a small figure stirring. It's one of the singing birds, its cage dented but intact, its mechanism somehow still running. It sings a few notes, stops, sings again, a broken song, a melody interrupted, but a song nonetheless. Someone must have wound it this morning, before the mob came, before everything changed. And now it sits in the rubble, singing its tiny heart out to an empty room, waiting for someone to hear. You pick up the cage and hold it close, and the bird continues to sing, unaware of where it is, unaware of the destruction around it, unaware that the world it was built for has vanished. It just sings, because that's what it was made to do, because its spring still holds energy, because its pins still lift its levers, because somewhere a craftsman filed its cams and tuned its song and sent it out into a world that promised to last forever. The world didn't last. But the bird did, and its song, broken and beautiful, is the only sound in the silence. Historians still argue whether the destruction of the automata during the revolution was a deliberate act of class warfare or simply collateral damage, the inevitable result of mobs running wild through aristocratic homes. The truth is probably both, because revolutions aren't tidy and they don't make distinctions between symbols and people, between toys and treasures. What matters is what survived, what was hidden, what was carried away by hands that recognized value beyond price. And as you stand in the ruined workshop, holding your singing bird, you realize that you've become one of those hands. You're a survivor now, a keeper of memories, a witness to what was lost and what somehow, impossibly, remains. The bird sings on in its dented cage, and you carry it with you as the years blur past, as the revolution gives way to the directory to the consulate to the empire, and still the bird sings, its mechanism slowly wearing, its song growing faint but never quite silent. You find yourself in places you never expected to visit, attics in abandoned townhouses, cellars beneath buildings scheduled for demolition, the back rooms of curiosity shops where dust gathers on objects no one remembers. And everywhere you go, you find them, the survivors, the hidden ones, the automata that escaped the flames and the hammers and the mobs, waiting in the darkness for someone to wind their springs again. The year is 1820, and you're climbing the creaking stairs of a forgotten manor on the outskirts of Lyon, a place that's been empty since the owners fled during the terror and never returned. The stairs groan under your weight, and dust rises in clouds with each step. But you keep climbing because someone told you a story, because there's always another story, because the automata have a way of drawing you forward even when you think you've found them all. At the top of the stairs, a door stands slightly ajar, and when you push it open, you find yourself in a child's nursery frozen in time. A small bed with a faded canopy. A wooden horse on rockers, its paint chipped, its manner missing. A shelf of books whose spines have crumbled to dust. And in the corner, slumped in a chair as if exhausted, a mechanical figure. It's a shepherdess, dressed in silk that was once blue and is now the color of a faded sky, her porcelain face still intact, her glass eyes still bright, her hand still raised in a gesture that might once have meant something. You approach her slowly, afraid of what you'll find, and when you're close enough to see, you realize that her mechanism is intact. The dust has protected her, kept the gears from corroding, kept the springs from rusting. She's been waiting here for 30 years, since some child was taken away and never came back, since the doors were locked and the windows shuttered and the world outside forgot this place existed. You wind her carefully, afraid the mechanism might crumble, but the spring turns smoothly and the ratchet clicks with the sound of something waking from a long sleep. You step back and watch, and slowly, so slowly you almost miss it, the shepherdess begins to move. Her chest rises with simulated breath. Her eyes open wider, scanning the room as if searching for the child who used to watch her. Her hand lowers, reaches toward a lamb that's supposed to be at her feet but isn't there anymore, lost somewhere in the years. And from somewhere inside her, a sound emerges, a thin, reedy melody, the tune of a shepherd's pipe, played so softly you have to lean close to hear it. The music is halting at first, then smoother as the mechanism warms to its task, and for a few minutes the nursery is filled with a song that hasn't been heard since before Napoleon conquered Europe, since before anyone in this house was born or died or forgotten. You sit on the edge of the child's bed and listen, and you think about all the years this shepherdess spent in darkness, all the silence she endured, all the time that passed while she waited for someone to care enough to wind her spring. She doesn't know about the revolution, about the wars, about the world that changed while she slept. She only knows that she was made to play for a child, and now she's playing, and the child isn't here. But the music continues anyway because that's what she was made to do. When the spring runs down and she falls still, you wind her again, because you can't bear to let the silence return. And she plays again, the same tune, the same notes, the same performance she's given 1,000 times and will give 1,000 more if anyone remembers to wind her. You leave the shepherdess in her nursery when you go, because she belongs here, because moving her would be wrong somehow, because the child who loved her might come back even though you know they won't. But you carry her image with you, and you find yourself searching more urgently, visiting more attics, more cellars, more forgotten rooms where the survivors might still be waiting. In a farmhouse in the countryside, you find a mechanical monkey that beats a drum, its mechanism damaged but still capable of a few ragged thumps. In a Parisian junk shop, buried under broken furniture and yellowed newspapers, you discover a singing bird in an unbroken cage, its song as clear as the day it was made. In a convent south of the city, the nuns show you a small automaton of the Virgin Mary that they've kept hidden since the Revolution, winding it once a year on her feast day and letting the sisters watch her move. Each survivor has a story, and you collect them like a magpie collecting shiny things. This one was hidden in a bread oven when the mob came, rescued later by a servant who couldn't bear to see it destroyed. That one traveled in a peddler's cart for 50 years, traded from village to village, eventually forgotten in a barn where you found it under a pile of hay. Another spent decades in a wealthy collector's cabinet, passed down through generations, finally sold at auction and bought by someone who didn't know what it was and stored it in an attic where it waited for you. The stories are different, but they all end the same way, with you, standing in the dust and silence, winding a spring and watching a miracle unfold. Historians still argue about how many 18th century automata survived into the 19th century, and their estimates vary widely. Some say only a handful made it through the revolution and the wars that followed. Others point to the constant stream of mechanical figures appearing at auctions and in private collections, suggesting that many more survived than anyone knows. The truth is that no one can be sure, because the automata were never systematically catalogued, never treated as the treasures they would later become. They were toys, curiosities, objects of wonder that people kept or sold or threw away depending on their circumstances. Some ended up in museums, some in private collections, some in the hands of people who didn't know what they had and used them as doorstops or children's playthings. And some, you're certain, are still waiting, still hidden, still holding their breath in attics and cellars and forgotten rooms, waiting for someone to find them and win them and let them live again. You climb one last set of stairs, but these stairs are familiar, and the door at the top opens onto a gallery you recognize. The year is now the present, or close enough, and you're back in the quiet museum where this journey began. The crowds have long gone home, the security guard has made his final round, and you're alone with the automata, just as you were when you started. But now you know them differently. Now each figure in its glass case carries stories you've lived, histories you've witnessed, lives you've shared. You walk slowly through the gallery, pausing at each case, and the automata seem to watch you pass, their glass eyes following, their mechanical chests rising and falling with simulated breath. The writer is here, the real one, the original that Jacquet-Droz built with his own hands. He sits at his mahogany desk, dressed in silk that has faded from crimson to something closer to dried roses, his porcelain face still bearing that slight asymmetry that makes him seem individual, particular, real. His hand rests beside the quill, and his eyes are fixed on some middle distance, waiting for someone to wind his spring and give him a message to write. You stand before his case and press your palm against the cool glass, and you remember watching Jacquet-Droz file his cams by candlelight, remember the moment when the little boy first wrote a sentence, remember the philosopher's debates and the nobleman's love letters and the mob that smashed his brothers in a Paris street. This one survived. This one made it through the revolution and the wars and the centuries, and here he sits, still waiting to write. Beside him, in an adjoining case, sits the musician, her organ restored, her fingers poised above the keys. Her dress has been conserved, the silk stabilized, the embroidery carefully repaired by hands that understand they're preserving something precious. Her eyes still move when the mechanism runs, still follow visitors across the room, still create that unsettling illusion of awareness. And when the museum occasionally wins her and lets her play, the visitors who hear her forget for a moment that they are listening to a machine. They close their eyes and let the music wash over them, and somewhere in that suspension of disbelief, they touch something that the 18th century understood better than our own: the mystery of life, the impossibility of drawing a clean line between mechanism and miracle. The draftsman is here too, in a third case, his pencil ready, his paper waiting. The drawings he produces are the same ones he's always produced: the dog, the Cupid, the portrait of Louis XVI that now seems impossibly distant, a relic of a world that vanished so completely that most visitors don't even recognize the king. But they recognize the act of drawing, the way the pencil moves, the way the eyes follow the emerging lines. They watch him work, and they wonder what it would be like to be him, to repeat the same actions forever, to never forget or vary or grow tired. And in wondering, they confront questions about their own lives, their own repetitions, their own small performances. You move through the gallery, past the singing birds in their jeweled cages, past the mechanical musicians and dancers and shepherds, past the tiny monkeys that beat drums and the miniature tigers that bare their teeth. Each one has a story, and you know most of them now, know which craftsman built them, which nobleman owned them, which servant hid them, which collector found them and brought them here. The gallery has become a kind of memory palace, a place where the 18th century lives on in brass and porcelain, where the dreams of long-dead craftsmen still move and breathe and perform. And as you walk among them, you realize that you've become part of their story too, that your journey through their world has woven you into the fabric of their survival. The museum has a small auditorium where, during the day, they show a film about the automata and their creators. You've seen it, and you remember the moment when the narrator mentions that no one knows exactly how many automata were built in the 18th century, or how many survived. The camera lingers on the writer's face, and the narrator's voice softens as she says, "Somewhere, perhaps, there are still automata waiting to be found, in attics, in cellars, in the back rooms of shops where no one thinks to look. They are waiting for someone to wind their springs, to let them move again, to remember what they were made for." You think about the shepherdess in the abandoned nursery, still playing her pipe to an empty room. You think about all the others you didn't find, all the ones still waiting, all the stories that will never be told. But the ones that are here, the ones you can see, are enough. You return to the writer's case and stand before him one last time. The light in the gallery has dimmed as the evening deepens, and his face seems to glow in the soft illumination, his glass eyes reflecting the faint gleam of the security lights. You imagine him writing one final message, the message you would give him if you could program his cams yourself. 40 characters, the length of a short sentence, a line of poetry, a child's prayer. What would you ask him to write? What words would you want to see formed by those brass fingers, dipped in ink, pressed onto paper that would last beyond your own brief life? You don't have an answer, and maybe that's the point. The writer doesn't need your message. He's been writing messages for 2.5 centuries, and he'll write them for centuries more, long after you're gone, long after the museum itself is gone, long after the last person who remembers your name has turned to dust. His message is the act of writing itself, the proof that human hands can make something that outlasts them, that human minds can encode thought in forms that persist beyond their own brief existence. He writes, and in writing, he testifies that we were here, that we wondered, that we tried to make sense of a world that doesn't owe us meaning. The gallery grows darker, and you know it's time to go. But you linger one more moment, listening. Somewhere in the silence, you hear it, a faint ticking, so soft you might have imagined it, the sound of gears settling, of springs relaxing, of mechanisms that have been running for centuries and will run for centuries more. The gentle mechanics of a vanished century, refusing to fall completely silent. You turn away from the writer and walk toward the exit, and as you go, you carry that ticking with you, a heartbeat that isn't a heartbeat, a pulse that measures time in ways no clock can capture. The automata will be here tomorrow, waiting for the crowds, waiting to perform, waiting to make someone wonder. And somewhere in the back of your mind, the music of their mechanisms plays on, a lullaby for a world that's always ending and always beginning again. You step out of the museum into the cool night air, and the door closes softly behind you. The street is quiet, the city asleep, and you stand for a moment looking up at the stars that have watched over all of this, over Vorkenson and his duck, over Jacquet-Droz and his writer, over the revolution and the ruins and the long slow work of survival. The stars don't care about automata, don't care about human striving or human art or human love. They just burn, patient and indifferent, while below them tiny mechanical creatures move and breathe and perform their endless, beautiful routines. You start walking, and as you go, you realize you're smiling. Not because anything has been solved or explained or understood. Just because, for a little while, you were part of something that mattered. Just because, somewhere behind you, a small brass boy is still waiting to write.